Thank you very much, Matt, for your wonderful speech. And everyone can see Matt is with us online. I'm sure all of us are very impressed that you chose to make your presentation in Chinese. This must be one of the few times, and most likely the only time, in which any American official has addressed Chinese audiences in Chinese from the White House. Can you tell us why you chose to make your remarks in Chinese? And for those who are only receiving the audio or were unable to read the subtitles clearly, what was the most important message you sought to deliver to our Chinese-speaking audiences? And is there anything else you want to add for our English-speaking audiences, Matt?
Shirley, thanks so much for hosting me today and for allowing me to share those thoughts. I understand that some people may have had some technical problems reading all of the subtitles in English. So we'll make sure that we get the Chinese text and the English text of my remarks made available later today, hopefully. So thanks again. You know, you had mentioned that you wanted me to just make some remarks, and it happened to be on the 101st anniversary of the May 4th movement. And so I think that it was natural that I would focus on the events 101 years ago and in the decades that really followed that. When I was studying the Chinese language more than 25 years ago, I had the real privilege of spending a summer in Beijing studying with the Princeton program there with Perry Link and with Zhou Zhiping. Zhou Zhiping is really a real authority on the period of history that I was discussing in those remarks. And the textbook that Zhou Zhiping and some of his colleagues put together that we were studying was a compendium of essays from Chinese intellectuals during this period of history 100 years ago. And over the last handful of years in particular, I've sometimes thought back to the essays that I read in that book and the fact that 100 years ago, in many respects, there was a greater plurality of voices in the public political discourse in China than what we see today, in spite of the internet, maybe perhaps because of the internet and the way that it's controlled so carefully by the authorities in Beijing. You don't really see, you have to really hunt hard, I should say, to find that kind of ferment and the kind of grappling and wrestling with the ideas of how to make China modern, what kind of government sort of compact should there be between the government and the citizens. You know, you look back 100 years at discussions about how to have citizen-centric, really how to build citizens. And so in my remarks, that's why I focused at the outset on the giant public intellectual. He was small in stature, but giant in his influence and in his thinking, and that was Hu Shi. He was just someone who had an impact in so many different areas, but one of the first, and the one that I focused on in the speech, was his move to provide a written language that the entire society could sink its teeth into and use and benefit from, rather than the classical old style of written Chinese that had prevailed for many, many centuries, all the way up into the 20th century until this period 100 years ago. And he was one of the key people who drove what was called the plain speech or the vernacular movement, where he said people should write in the language they speak, not in sort of the equivalent of Latin, but in modern vernacular language. And that's what really set on fire the idea that regular citizens, that the Laobaixing could participate in a discussion about China's future and about its politics. And that was extremely controversial back then. It was, I quoted one of the, a Chinese scholar who was a real thinker in his own right. He was a Western Lit professor at Peking University and a Confucian, who thought, he ridiculed the idea of mass literacy. He said, I mean, you want stable boys and you know, shopkeepers to be participating in politics? What's going to happen to our country if that happens? Of course, we now know that that democracy in some form has worked out quite well for Chinese societies, including in Taiwan. So the reason I spoke in Chinese was that it goes to that sort of what I was mentioning about this sort of shocking lack of diversity in voices. It's like what Dr. Li Wenliang said after his incredible contribution to all of us in raising the alarm about that virus before he succumbed to the virus in Wuhan. He said it's a healthy society should have more than one voice. It should have more than one voice. And so this is a bit of an effort just to have a conversation with friends in China. It's sometimes difficult to cut through the noise from whether it's propaganda from the wholly state-owned media in China, or the carefully curated social media ecosystem in China, which is you know, that ecosystem is shockingly lacking in diversity when it comes to these sorts of issues that the intellectuals were wrestling with 100 years ago. It's enormously diverse on a zillion other things. I mean, but not on these questions about politics, about modernizing culture, about history. And so this is an effort to reach out in the Chinese language and open up a conversation with friends in China and around the world.
Shirley, you're on mute.
That's right. Thank you very much, Matt. Now we're on to the exciting part of the program. We have lots of excellent questions from many people who actually know you already, Matt, but we're going to be fair and pick the best questions. So on to Harry.
Yes, hi, Matt. Thanks very much. Our first question comes from a viewer named Mo Roping. And he noted that you described both the Brexit movement and the election of Donald Trump, as well as the May 4th movement, as being populist. And so what he asks is, how do you relate Trump's election to the White House to the spirit of the May 4th movement?
It's a great question. You know, when we were rather hastily piecing together this speech over the weekend, and I was working with a couple friends to translate what I wrote in English first into Chinese so that I could deliver it in Chinese. I wrestled a lot with the Chinese term for populism, because the term for populism in Chinese, it's usually translated as 民粹主义. And there is a pejorative ring to that term. And so I took a friend's advice to use a different term. And it was 平民主义, which 平民 is like citizens or civilians. So it's the idea again of citizenship being at the heart of the enterprise, at the heart of the politics. And so I think that whether it's China or the United States or the UK or Brazil or really any part of the world, there is a fundamental question about government that is citizen-centric and government that is regime-centric, and that it's a perennial old issue, and it's one that was really what May 4th movement intellectuals were grappling with. And so I think that there are currents, you know, there are a lot of forms of populism. What I'm talking about, and I think what the wave that brought President Trump into office is what I would call a democratic populism. It was a effort, more than an effort, it was an expression of frustration on the parts of the American people that a powerful elite was growing too remote and too self-interested in the views of so many people. And I think that that was actually a decisive factor in that election, just as it was in the Brexit vote. And so I thought that was a terrific question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And we'll go on to the next question now, who comes from Will Malden. And he thanks you for the presentation. And he says, with some in the administration calling for the US to take measures against China for allowing or covering up the coronavirus outbreak, does Washington have any economic options it could use without blowing up the 3-month-old phase 1 trade agreement?
Yeah, so look, the best authority on this is President Trump himself, who talked about this actually just yesterday in a town hall meeting. So the U.S. isn't looking at punitive measures here. What President Trump is looking at doing is continuing with the policy that he ran on, the policy that he's implemented, which is to have a reciprocal and fair relationship with China, not one in which the U.S. Allows ourselves to be taken advantage of in the hope that somehow China will just automatically liberalize. That has not happened. In fact, in many respects, Chinese friends of mine believe that China is moving in a much more illiberal direction in recent years, following the entry into the WTO in 2001. Some have argued that China coming to the WTO did not hasten or accelerate a move towards liberalism, but actually removed the impetus for further reforms in the market realm, as well as certainly in the political realm, because the entry into the WTO allowed China's system to become much wealthier through its access to capital and access to overseas markets in Europe, the United States, and so on. I'd refer you to President Trump's remarks yesterday. We have a deal, an initial phase 1 trade deal that was signed at the beginning of this year. President Trump has every expectation and desire to see China fulfill its end of the bargain, and he's made clear that he's not going to remove tariffs. The tariffs are what allowed us to give us the leverage to actually achieve that deal in the first place. And he's going to be watching very carefully to make sure that China holds up its end of the bargain.
Thank you. Next one comes from Professor Rana Mitter. Congratulations on your fluent and thoughtful speech. My question is, the May 4th spirit included genuine cosmopolitanism and learning from each other's cultures, and China learned much from the West during May 4th. What can we in the West learn from China's May 4th experience?
So, that's a great question, and I think Professor Mitter would give a much better answer than I can, given how well steeped he is in this history. I mentioned in my remarks the example of Zhang Pengchun, P.C. Chang, who I think I used his example because he was someone who did come to the United States on one of those indemnity scholarships, just like Hu Shi. He studied under the great Du Wei, John Dewey, who was a very influential educator and philosopher at Columbia University. He learned a lot about theater and brought some of that back to China. But the really interesting thing about P.C. Chang is that he then came back to the West with a head full of ideas about how China should influence the world, how it should influence conversations about philosophy. And most decisively, his biggest contribution was his role in drafting the Declaration on Human Rights that Eleanor Roosevelt, she chaired that panel, and that was adopted in the late 40s as this seminal document designed to try to prevent humanity from descending into the horrors of the first half of the 20th century ever again. And so P.C. Chang brought to the table a very Chinese perspective. He said that human rights is not exclusively the domain of Western Christianity. It is not the domain of ancient Western philosophy. There are currents, very strong currents of human rights in Confucianism and in the long 2 millennia following Confucius, and so he had a decisive effect in really putting the word universal into the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So I think that's one potent example. Thank you.
Thank you.
Matt, the next question comes from someone who I think you know, Jaime Florcruz, also a journalist. And he says, aside from invoking or inviting Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science to come to China, the other legacy of the May 4th movement was the popular goal or even obsession of Zhengxing Zhonghua to rejuvenate China and to oppose foreign bullying. Do you agree with that? And how does that affect American policy toward China today? How do you coexist with the people and a political power who wish to make their nation great again and that resents being told that they should should do bullying?
What they should do to fight off bullying.
What they should do to fight off bullying.
Yeah, great. It's great to know that Jaime Florcruz is on the line, and thanks for the question. It's been a long time. It'd be great to see you sometime. The rejuvenation of China absolutely was one of the core themes as well of the May 4th movement. And of course, it's called the May 4th movement because students were so outraged by China's shoddy treatment by all the Western powers in Japan at the Treaty of Versailles talks that they took to the streets. China's felt like it was being carved up. China didn't fight as a combatant in World War I, but it did provide a lot of labor into Europe on the side of the Allies, and it got a really raw deal. The Versailles Treaty was a raw deal for a lot of people in a lot of countries. China got a really raw deal on that, which is why people took to the streets. And when they weren't allowed to continue the demonstration, some of the students went and actually burned down a few houses of Chinese officials. One of the Chinese officials whose house got burnt down was an official who had accepted a very predatory loan by the Japanese government to China that they thought would surrender, in essence, Chinese sovereignty to the Japanese through debt diplomacy. And so they burnt down that official's house. So rejuvenating China, I don't know anyone who has ever who spent significant time in China who did not, especially in the years leading up to the turn of the century. I was lucky to work as a journalist in the late 90s in China because it was a hopeful moment. There was a lot of reform going on of the economy. There was the beginning of the internet in the early days in China. The internet was a little bit more wild and free, and you did hear more of that plurality of voices that Li Wenliang so sorely missed, as he commented on his deathbed. No foreigner that I knew in that time wasn't rooting for China to rejuvenate. People were rooting for China's success. We were rooting for the success of the Chinese people, and we took enormous pleasure in the creativity, entrepreneurial spirit, and drive of the Chinese people over the course of the reform and opening period before that period ended just a handful of years ago. I think that it's hard to argue that reform and opening still exists as we interpret it at that point. But in terms of bullying and so forth, there's a danger. I talked at the end of my remarks, the Chinese portion, about balancing nationalism and this instinct to be great again with responsive, accountable government. If you do introduce democratic norms and you do have a more accountable government, it actually makes the odds of greatness for the country even greater.
Thank you, Matt. We're quickly running out of time, but if we could extend your time for one more question. This is from Ted Pulling. Matt, you lived in Hong Kong and know the city well. How do you see events playing out in that city? And maybe you could reference the impending legislative election, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. Is it worth Washington's time to get involved in Hong Kong, or is it an internal matter for Beijing?
Yeah, look, the Sino-British joint declaration, which allowed for the return of Hong Kong to China, is a document that is clearly binding. It's a binding document. It was a document that was recognized by governments around the world as such. It was a document that was registered as a treaty at the United Nations. The US is watching with real concern the erosion of the promises that were made on the Chinese side of that agreement. And frankly, I mentioned in my Chinese remarks the example of the millions of people in Hong Kong who took to the streets peacefully last year, peacefully. Millions of people. We're talking about a massive percentage. It was of Hong Kongers got on their feet and went out into the streets to advocate for their rights under the basic law, what was promised to them as part of that Sino-British joint declaration, and really, in essence, in support of maintaining the rule of law. And the rule of law is sometimes mistranslated. In fact, it's uniformly mistranslated by the Chinese government as 依法治国, which is a little sleight of hand that means using the law to run a country rather than the law being supreme to the men and women who have the privilege of serving in government. And so 法治 in the true sense is as I defined it in the speech.
Thanks. Here's a question from Drew Thompson. Matt, you mentioned Taiwan in your speech. Can you elaborate on how Taiwan's democratic system shapes US policy towards the island? With 23 million people, is Taiwan, in your opinion, a viable model for a much larger China?
Yeah, Drew, thanks for the question. And, as I mentioned earlier, PC Chang resigned his job as an official. He was a storied diplomat. He'd been China's ambassador to several countries and several different civilizations, different parts of the world. And in the end, after his work on the Universal Declaration, he resigned because he was frustrated with the lack of progress towards democracy. And I can't speak to how he would view it today, but I think that Taiwan has been a pretty astonishing example of, shows sort of the bankruptcy of the claim that China's not ready or Chinese people aren't suited to democracy and so forth. That's not to say that that's what we're foisting on anybody. As I mentioned in the speech, how China governs itself is going to be up to the Chinese people. It's not for anyone else to decide. The May 4th movement belongs to the Chinese people, There's a lot that we've learned from it, but it belongs to them. And the speech today was really just an attempt to remind a current generation of friends of the United States and in China and elsewhere of the legacy of that movement.
Well, thanks very much, Pat. I wish we had more time. We have lots more questions. But having heard your keynote speech, we now have a second keynote conversation with James Steinberg that will be introduced and moderated by Bill Antholis. Over to you, Bill.